Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our NCAFP program. I'm Jeff Schaefer, and I'm chairman of the board of the National Committee. For those of you who are new to our programs, the organization is a nonpartisan policy group that's engaged in numerous Track 2 initiatives. It's also a membership organization maintaining an active and diverse array of closed-door and also open public programs like the one you're joining this morning. Our program today is going to help to analyze and clarify the recent trends of far-right leaders in European elections. I'm not going to go into detail about the background of this, but to help explore these issues, we have Mike Smeltzer, Senior Research Analyst for Nations in Transit at Freedom House, and Ms. Laura Thornton, Director and Senior Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. Our moderator this morning, I'm very pleased to say, is Nick Thompson, who is one of our NCAFP trustees, and he's also CEO of the Atlantic. So let me say before I turn it over to Nick that should you have a question during today's discussion for our panelists, we ask that you please use the Q&A box at the top of your screen, and our moderator will read the question during the Q&A portion of the program. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available online on our website and YouTube channel in the coming days. Now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Nick.
All right, thank you, Jeff. I am delighted to be here, delighted to be part of yet another fabulous National Committee event. Jeff forgot to mention, but we have a gala coming up and everybody should take part of it, support it, and it will be incredible. But what's going to be incredible today is this conversation, because we're talking about one of the most interesting questions in the world, the rise of authoritarianism, the decline of democracy. Why the hell is that happening? I didn't think that was going to happen. Certainly, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, I would not have predicted the nasty trajectory we're on. So by the end of this conversation, we're going to understand what's going on, why it's going on, and perhaps what we can do to reverse those trends. Thrilled to have Mike here, thrilled to have Laura here. We're going to talk for 30, 35 minutes, and then we're going to go to audience Q&A. If you have a question, as Jeff said, put it in the Q&A bar. I'll be scanning them, looking at them. I'll either jump in, interrupt them, or we'll go straight to it at 10:40, 10:45. Let's get cracking. Mike, you're the man with the data. Your data is depressing, shows a bunch of lines going in the wrong direction. Please explain the state of democracy in the world right now.
Yeah, so it's not doing very well, obviously. That's why we're having this conversation. So if you look at Freedom House's research, right, we're a nonprofit that focuses on kind of promoting democracy around the world. And part of our research is tracking the rise and fall of democracy in all of the 215 countries and territories around the world. And one of our reports, our flagship report, is Freedom in the World, which looks at all of these and ranks their political rights and civil liberties as experienced by people on the ground. And what we've seen over the last 16 years is the world is less free. People have less freedom. People have less civil rights, political liberties. They are unable to do the things that we all appreciate here in sort of the democratic world. And this has only gotten worse over time. And if you look at the region that I'm an expert on, which is kind of Central Eastern Europe and Eurasia, this democratic decline has actually been going on for 18 years. So for even longer than we've seen this global democratic decline. And the reasons for this are many. We can talk about them today. But one of the big things that we've identified recently is authoritarian actors really going on the offensive, going out and saying, look, democracy is not working in the world. There's this alternative called authoritarianism or autocracy, in which, look at China, they're doing quite well in the world economically. They're providing sort of alternatives to democracy. And in some cases, as we're seeing now with Russia's sort of unilateral, unbelievable invasion of Ukraine, they're willing to impose this by force. And so we're seeing all of these kind of different methods and modes of authoritarianism coming to the fore. And that just spells kind of disaster for democracy right now. And I'm hoping we can talk about some bright sides, but at least for the last 18 years, the news has not been great.
We'll get to the bright sides quickly on the Europe portion of this. What countries have you seen the most backsliding in over the last decade?
Yeah, so in Europe specifically, in Central Europe, we've seen Poland and Hungary as kind of the two biggest backsliders. Everybody else in kind of the EU has had these ups and downs, has either stagnated or dealt with some moderate or modest declines. But Hungary and Poland really stand out in our data. Hungary being sort of the farthest to fall in our rankings, going from a consolidated democracy to what we call a hybrid regime in our Nations in Transit report. That's a country that has democratic institutions. They exist, they have elections, they have a judiciary, but they're sort of married or abused by authoritarian practices. And that's like really key to understand right now, is that many of these countries, including authoritarian countries like Russia, have elections, they have parliaments, they have presidents, but the ways that these institutions act, the behavior, the practices that inhabit these institutions, they are purely authoritarian. And Poland's another good example. It's sort of a shining example of standing up for Ukrainian democracy right now, providing support to refugees that are fleeing the war. But at the same time, domestically, there's a lot that's concerning, particularly when it comes to Poland's concerns with rule of law and the judiciary. So, those are two great examples of deeply concerning trends within Europe.
Okay, Laura, well, let's talk about the obvious next question, which is why? What are the trends that came together, started 16 years ago, have continued, have not been reversed? What is it about this period in history that has led to a 16-year losing streak?
Well, thank you. And also just want to thank the National Committee. No, I agree with everything Mike said. I would add Slovenia to backsliding EU countries. And also just to put into context, while we have seen this, dangerous backsliding over the last 15 years or so, I do want to, be that person to remind everyone that since 1975, we have seen great progress. So if you step back at a bird's eye view and look at the trends over time, just, 57% of the world's population live in democracies. That was 38% in 1975. So just putting that out there. Now, why? Well, I think that there's a lot of reasons to unpack. I think Mike referred to some of it, which is the rise of autocratic actors. But what are they taking advantage of? And I think they are taking advantages of failures in democracy. So when democracy isn't delivering adequately, and particularly with regard to equality, people feel that democracy has left out a lot of them. So if you listen to a focus group in the country Georgia or in Mississippi or in Poland, you're going to hear a similar, it's not fair, it's rigged, the elites have captured the system. And so that has sort of eroded faith and sort of the social contract with the state. I think another obvious example is, the growth of social media, which we might talk about later, has also just provided this, lighter fluid to the stage. In other words, autocrats can now communicate directly and infiltrate the minds of people directly with their messages, filling the vacuum of dissatisfaction with their narratives. And I think an important consideration is also fear. So fear is a big mobilizer for autocrats. Now, whether it's fear of caravans of immigrants or fear of criminality, or, they're coming for you, or fear of loss of dominance. For years, even though it was a democracy, it mostly provided power to the dominant race, culture, ethnic group, and predominantly to men. And as that has started to shift and change, and there's been more diversity, and you're not necessarily at the top of the pecking order, that is something that is very fearful to people and can be taken advantage of by strongmen. And they also offer simple solutions to complex problems. I'm going to drain the swamp. I'm Robin Hood. I'm going to, fix all these problems for you. And I'm going to fight for you and your identity. So I think it's just a huge combination of different factors that have led to this attractiveness of the strongman. And I think we also have to, and I'll end here, there's so much more to talk about, but I think what characteristics of strongmen that are very interesting is their ability to seem authentic and their ability to fight. Their language is that of a fighter, fighting for you, fighting for your values against this fearful thing. So I think that we've seen that trend. And again, it's not unique to Europe. It's not unique to the United States and North America. It's happening around the world. So we have to consider the vacuum that we've created that has allowed these actors to come in.
So first off, I want to say I feel like there's a real parallel between my life and the state of this. I was born in 1975. I basically improved cognitively and physically until about 2006, and I'm steady decline for 16 years, more or less matching your data. So
see, maybe we're all on this trajectory.
So about 40 years from now, democracy will start to return to where it was. Let's talk about those different factors. You had three fascinating factors: inequality, social media, fear. Let's talk about the third one first. So that leads to a kind of counterintuitive conclusion, maybe not a popular conclusion, but listening to you, it sounds like countries that open up, provide more freedoms to people, liberalize things for women, creates fear and displacement, leads to crackdown on democracy. Are there countries that have been less open to these liberalizing trends, have not increased rights for ethnic minorities, have not increased rights for women? Have those countries been more successful at maintaining democracy?
Well, I would argue that by doing so, that they're not truly democratic. So, I mean, I think that there are countries that have done that, and there are countries that maybe opened up a little bit and allowed for more diversity and representation that are now reversing those orders because they see, the impacts of that. But I would argue that, a true democratic state allows for full representation and participation of citizens. I think what's interesting, and sort of Mike alluded to this, is this idea of democracy versus liberalism, because what we've seen, particularly in I would say the third wave of democracy, when I joined as a democracy hack in the 90s, it was that third wave, and it was very much focused on majoritarianism. It was all about electoral democracy, and even our foreign policy support overseas was about free and fair elections and training political parties. And I think what it neglected in many places was that liberalism. So rule of law, constitutionalism, protection for minorities. And so what we've had is sort of hyper-majoritarianism. And so leaders like Orban have really, I think, seized upon that. And he's even coined, I'm sure it existed before him, but he claims the term illiberal democracy. So, we can be a democracy because the people like us and we're populist and they elect us through elections that we might not even need to rig, but we're illiberal. So we're not going to provide those protections and those constitutional safeguards for minorities. Of course, in the end, it's an oxymoron, in my view. Liberalism, in the end, means eroding freedom of speech and media freedom and judicial rule of law and checks and balances, in which case you're no longer really having free and fair elections because you don't have a free media. And in Hungary's case, they've ripped apart even the election system to gerrymander to such an extreme point, for example, that you're really you're getting constitutional majorities without the same voter output. So I guess that's a long way of saying that countries that weren't particularly liberal, in my view, didn't really meet those democratic credentials in the first place.
Mike, is Laura right that democracy and liberalism are necessarily twinned?
I 100% agree with that. I mean, this is kind of the Freedom House perspective, actually. When we talk about political rights and civil liberties, it's not just the political rights. It's not just the ability to go to the polls and vote. I mean, people in Russia have the ability to go to the polls and vote, but there are all of these institutions and practices that the ruling regime can use to manipulate that, whether it be by controlling the media, whether it be by outlawing particular people from being able to vote, whether it be through gerrymandering, as in Hungary. There are all of these different things that, even if the institutions and electoral processes exist in a way that provides for some kind of bare minimum sense of electoral freedom, one's personal freedoms are not what they were. They're not what you would expect from one of the upstanding liberal democracies.
So let's use some examples. Is Israel democracy?
That is a good question. I mean, I think it depends on, again, looking at our data. I think it's classified as a free country right now. It's either kind of on the range of free to partly free, I believe. I'm not an expert on Israel, so I will pass that to Laura if she has any thoughts.
Well, I'm not an expert on Israel either, but I think there is there's always, my Israeli friends will say this very openly, that there's, somewhat of a conflict between democratic rule and religious state, right? Particularly when it comes to what we were talking about, majority rules. So the very nature of maintaining a Jewish state is also could be at times in conflict with majority rule. Because if the shifting population is such that it is no longer Jewish, then what happens to the nature of the state? So many Israeli Democrats, and I worked with one wonderful academic named Shaul Kimhi, who has really examined this issue of how to maintain a religious democracy. And it's a tricky question.
Is there a flip side question where if Israel is the place where you have the freest and fairest elections without guaranteeing rights to people, is there a place where you have, or without guaranteeing rights to a certain subsets of people, is there a flip side example where you have an authoritarian regime that actually does the best of guaranteeing rights? Like, where is the place where there's the most LGBTQ rights, but an authoritarian leader?
I mean, it's hard to think of a scenario in which that's the case, in which you have full civil liberties, but decreased political rights, because they're so intertwined, right? Like, you have your civil liberties are necessary for ensuring your own political rights. And at the same time, your political rights, being able to elect your leaders, are necessary for ensuring one's own civil liberties. So if you look at Freedom House data, for instance, you kind of see this correlation between declining political rights and declining civil liberties, at the same time with increasing political rights and increasing civil liberties. So it's hard to imagine some sort of like hypothetical country where you have a, let's say, benevolent dictator, right? There is, however, let's say, a case like Hungary, where you have an authoritarian leader who is kind of rigging elections for his favor, and yet people still have basic civil liberties. They can largely say what they want without being arrested. They can go about their lives. But at the same time, there's something missing there. They can't really change things to increase their own position and their society. You look at recent protests that have happened in Hungary with teachers out there striking for better wages. That's happened in the last couple of weeks. They can't really do anything about that because they don't have the political rights to be able to elect a government that will increase their wages. And so, because of the intertwining nature of these things, it's hard to imagine a situation with that happening.
Super interesting. All right, well, let's go back. I want to work through Laura's 3 factors before our time runs out. So let's go to factor number 2, social media. Do you think, Laura, that it was inevitable, once we had mass communication where everybody could talk to everybody with zero friction, that once we had that the forces unleashed would start to fray democracy and help authoritarianism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny how we've evolved on this. Initially, the evolution of social media was just a gift to Democrats. I mean, I lived 20 years in Southeast Asia in non-democracies. I was living in Cambodia, and the advent of social media was just wonderful for our democratic activists and partners to be able to communicate with one another because they didn't have access to mainstream media. And so it was considered a real boon to democracy. And of course, as we see, that's very much a double-edged sword, because now, I mean, with the openness of this tool, it allows everyone to participate. And I think that we as humans, are just naturally susceptible to bad information. I mean, it's not new. Hannah Arendt, the brilliant political writer of the 50s, was like, we are addled by a combination of cynicism and gullibility. So this is not new to us. So malevolent actors can take advantage and manipulate our emotions and fears. I can go into great detail where we're failing in this fight, but I think one of the major ways we're failing against malign actors is in our approach to communications. Our adversaries are excellent, particularly Russia, I would say. They are able to pull on our heartstrings. They're able to create images. They're able to use humor. The RT Sputnik Espanol has 10 times the following of Voice of America. And we spend millions of dollars on public diplomacy, but they are using memes and TikToks and creative ways to infiltrate our minds. And we're susceptible to that. So I think that this has absolutely been the accelerant to rising authoritarians. They are simple communicators, good communicators, funny communicators, emotional communicators, and we counter them with a 10-point fact sheet. And it's just not a fair competition. So we need to, and I view this as not, oh, we need to start squeezing the water balloon and shutting off all these channels because that's a fool's errand. I'm in the belief that we need to do a better job, preemptive, pre-bunking, predicting, getting ahead of the curve, and outsmarting our adversaries with truthful messages, but that play upon not only the minds of people with facts, but the hearts. We need to win hearts and minds here, and we're not.
Well, the good news is the National Committee is starting a very vibrant TikTok channel to help with meme warfare against autocracies. Let me, that's a super helpful, very incisive answer. Mike, let me ask you a variation of that. Let's say that Mark Zuckerberg, I don't know, 2011, whenever they introduced Newsfeed, and said, you know, this is going to get weaponized by bad actors. I'm going to put in every defensive mechanism I can to make sure that foreign propaganda doesn't spread, misinformation doesn't spread. We're going to, build fact checking in from the get-go. We're going to make sure that trusted news sources actually appear in a different color from, fake things created by Macedonians, and had really changed the structure. And Jack Dorsey had done the same thing at Twitter. Do you think that that would have had a large effect on these rankings? Do you think it would have had a small effect? Do you think it would have had no effect because somebody else would have just come up with, a place where you can weaponize and shitpost, and that would have been that?
Yeah, I always love when people ask the counterfactual because I can just say, I don't know. But no, it's a great question.
Answer.
Yeah, not here. I'm not gonna say I don't know. I'm actually gonna give a quick plug to my tech and democracy team at Freedom House. Their Freedom on the Net report comes out next week, where they analyze the state of internet freedom. So please keep an eye out for that. But to answer your question, I mean, if we think back to that time, like what are the things that are really driving and allowing authoritarians to abuse social media, the internet? It's kind of these algorithms. They're created in a way that feeds off dissension, disunion, anger, fear. And I think had we created a system that's not, that doesn't reward people by just creating this sort of content and reactions, yeah, it might have been different. But I don't think that social media, the internet are sort of inherently or implicitly a bad thing. I think there's a lot of good that democratizing force that the internet can be, but there's all these things that we have to do. And this is where I actually have some hope in this situation. I think there is a lot that we can do, but it requires that democracies, that democratic governments work with the private sector, work with a Zuckerberg to implement changes to the way that these social media companies and systems work, to prevent authoritarian actors from providing disinformation. And I will say, the point about communication that Laura made, it is just so spot on. And one thing that gives me a lot of hope is that just this week, just 2 days ago, Joseph Borrell, the High Rep of EU's foreign and security policy, he talked about this. He said, and I have the quote here because I thought it was so great, we have to explain what are the links between political freedom and a better life. This is a communication problem that we have right now. Our fight is trying to explain that democracy, freedom, political freedom, these are not something that can be exchanged for economic prosperity or social cohesion. These are things that go together. And we have to explain that right now because we have authoritarians on social media. Laura's team is actively showing us that they are making this messaging to Americans right now that these things don't work, that democracy has failed us. And we need to show that no, democracy works. It's a slow moving process, but it is the best process we have for kind of dealing with the societal disagreements that we have.
Are there countries that have been particularly resilient to foreign misinformation and attacks on democracy? Estonia comes to mind, Taiwan comes to mind. Where else have you seen countries that either through civic education, through counter warfare, through cultural factors, Japan comes to mind? Where is it that, what countries have been most resilient and why?
Well, I think actually a really important example that's very timely is Ukraine. I think they, particularly at the beginning of the war, their ability to do all those things I said, preempt, prebunk, predict, They're skilled because they've been under Kremlin malign influence for forever. And so they're very aware of the tactics in the toolbox. They have predictive capacity through their civil society groups have been monitoring and tracking the tools for a long time. Secondly, they are very good at putting out an emotional story, a real narrative. What is Ukraine? What does Ukraine stand for? I mean, the ghosts of Kiev, these like emotional, powerful stories that talk about the value of Ukrainian democracy and principles. And they were excellent at pre-bunking that with the help of US intelligence services, but they were able to get ahead of like, oh, by the way, Russia's going to say this. They're going to do this false flag thing. Get ready for it. Oh, here it's coming. So they actually modeled a lot of behaviors that I think we should be incorporating into our, daily defense against information operations. And of course, as Mike said, there's also, and I didn't mean to, swipe over the responsibility of social media companies, because certainly their business model is, as Mike said, based on hate. I'm sorry, it is. There have been experiments where, fake accounts have been set up to just even like somewhat misogynist material. And the algorithm then pummels that person with hateful content, incel content, violent content. So there is something that needs to be done. It is not an open square where everyone has the same voice and it's all chronologically listed. It is a square that's purposefully pushing hateful and harmful content. But I do think there are positive examples. Estonia, also our other Northern European friends, Finland, for example. I just came back from Helsinki and was learning some of the tactics they use. So I think there are points of light.
Right.
I would almost go further east and say Hong Kong and Taiwan. I mean, if you look at Beijing's global media influence around the world, we put out a recent report on this. They are incredibly resilient to the disinformation that the Chinese Communist Party is putting out. So we can kind of even get outside Europe and look at other places in the world that are actively pushing back on Chinese propaganda.
Right. That makes a lot of those are good examples and lots of good insights. Okay, so let's move to the third thing you said at the beginning. Actually, the first thing you said, but the third thing we're going to talk about, which is inequality. So inequality, it's not as though inequality was absent in 1975. Is there something about the nature of inequality, the way that globalism led to a separate class of extremely wealthy people living a different way? What is it about the nature of inequality in the last 16 years that has spurred discontent with democracy and excitement about authoritarianism?
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
No, you go ahead.
No, I mean, it's such an interesting question, because you're absolutely right. I mean, inequality has been baked into our world for forever. I think, though, there are a couple things at play. One, definitely, as you mentioned, globalization, but also just the changing nature of, for example, in 1975, what was the pay discrepancy between the CEO of a bank and the clerk at a bank? I don't remember. I think it's like 4-to-1 or something. And now what is it? So, you have just such gapping inequality. I think that's one, right? That's just sort of capitalism gone amok. The other is, of course, the expectation of democracy. We buy into the democratic experience because we think we're electing representatives who will represent us and our experiences. And that's why we believe in this exercise. However, if we see that not only does our representative body look nothing like us, in the United States, they're like 70-year-old millionaires who are white men, doesn't really represent the United States. Not only that money purchases that representation, whether it's illegal through corruption or legally through grotesque political finance regime. So we're sitting here going, our lives are getting worse off, or we see these huge discrepancies. We rely on democracy to correct those. We try to elect people that represent us and thus elevate our ability to live a meaningful life with economic growth. And we're not seeing that happen. And corruption in particular, I think, is the number one reward to autocrats. They love it, even though they're corrupt themselves, never mind. They bank on this. This is the thing that angers people everywhere. And if they say, I'm going to stop those criminals, I'm going to drain the swamp, I'm going to get rid of this, this is such an excellent selling point. So the more corrupt and dysfunctional a democracy is, whether through political finance or full-scale corruption, the greater opportunities autocrats have to come in.
Okay, well, we'll have to do something about the Biden crime family. So what is the playbook for reversing these trends? Let's start talking through. Clearly, changes in social media algorithms are one thing that seems like we could all agree on, but probably don't have a ton of influence on right now. Clearly, putting our own house in order, put our own oxygen mask on first before we start talking to the rest of the world about democracy. Laura, you've written about the need for the Biden administration to support pro-democratic groups in anti-democratic and non-democratic countries. Walk us through, both of you, walk us through, if you had an agenda of 3 or 4 things that the US could be doing, particularly for democracy in Central Eastern Europe, Western Europe too, what would those things be?
I guess I'll throw one out to begin with. And I think we've talked about communication, we've talked about social media. I think it's the role of independent media. I mean, they are vital in, one, providing us with the information that we as yes, exactly. Thank you, Nick. We as citizens require to know what's happening with our country, what's happening with our government, pushing back on the propaganda of our leaders who want us to believe that they're doing a perfect job. And that requires an independent media who has, diverse funding streams, not completely dependent on the public, not completely dependent on private funding. This requires some significant thinking about what the future of funding of independent media looks like, but also what their job is in a democracy. Is it to kind of look at both sides, or is it to provide accurate information about the state of affairs in the country, even if that means saying this one party is doing bad things, is being corrupt? It requires sort of a more democratic thinking of what role the independent media plays in our society, because it is a fundamental part of our democratic system. So I would say finding ways to bolster independent media has got to be at the top of this list.
Music to my ears, Laura?
100%. I agree with that. I also would make a specific plug for local media. I think, and this leads to sort of a bigger bucket of sort of a solution that we've been thinking about a lot at the Alliance, which is just that broader community resilience. So studies have shown, and I did some research on this in the former Soviet Union, where there's strong communities, where social cohesion is strong, where there's strong local media, where there's community life, whether it's a rec center or Girl Scouts or a public library, they tend to be more resilient, not just to information operations, but to malign influence, full stop. They tend to be less susceptible to rising authoritarianism. So what does that mean? It means, and I think we not only need to do this when we're thinking about how we support democratization in other parts of the world, but we need to do this domestically in the United States, which is focused very much on building out communities. How can we invest more in communities, in local media, in governance, in community life, where we've really lost some of that social cohesion? I think the other defense that we need to look at, we've talked about comms and information operations, but the broader authoritarian toolkit, and how can we raise the costs of that toolkit? So whether it's not just information operations, it's emerging technology and how that's being abused by malign actors. It's malign finance. How is economic coercion and other forms of oligarchic and malign money infiltrating into our systems? So how can we raise the costs of those, either through regulations or trade controls or sanctions or other things? And I think it really goes to treating this as warfare. It's warfare. And we need to treat it as such. So it's a criminal exercise. If a country is trying to influence our politics through bad information, that is a form of warfare. So we need to treat it as such. So I think that these are things that we can do. And supporting, as you said at the onset of the question, Democrats in hard places. Because to me, the only way this changes, I mean, whether it's in Russia or China, is going to happen internally. And there are Democrats in those countries fighting against tremendous odds. So what can we, and we are doing things, I'm not suggesting we're not, but what else can we be doing to support Democrats in non-democracies? And we cannot just leave them out of this conversation. So much of what we're talking about now is a little bit of an iron curtain, like autocracies and democracies over here, and we're in this club, and I'm the bouncer letting you in. And it's not that. It's democracy versus autocracy. These are ideas that exist across countries. They don't have borders. So I think we need to really consider how we can pull them in and provide more support.
Can we talk about China for a second? You just mentioned it. To me, it seems like, well, Poland, 10 years from now, Poland could reverse course, get democracy in Poland, right? Italy could be totally more open to democracy, less open to fascism. Brazil could be much more stable. China. Do you actually think that there will be structural democratic reforms in China that are meaningful in the next decade? Is that a possibility?
I don't like to say anything's impossible. China is a hard nut to crack. It doesn't have the muscle memory of democracy. But I was living in Indonesia in 1990. And if you asked me, is Suharto going to fall? I would have been like, what? No way. Not comparable, but just never say never. Change has happened in very extraordinary ways and in extraordinary places. So I wouldn't rule it out, but Mike might have more expertise on this than I.
No, I'm more of an expert on Russia, which I think is its own interesting case of this. What's the future of a democratic Russia? And like Laura, I don't want to just be pessimistic, but we also have to recognize the reality of Russia right now is that a lot of the Democrats living in Russia aren't actually living in Russia. They've had to flee. They've had to flee this repressive regime. And when you think about, what does Russia look like post-Putin, it's hard to imagine a just quick turnaround to a democratic Russia, because who's in line to replace him are other hardliners. That's who he's kept around. Even the once, kind of liberal Medvedev, the former president, has become this sort of hardline nationalist figure. So a lot of these people have had to kind of toady to this Putin view of a revanchist, irredentist, imperial Russia. And there aren't many rational democratic voices left that could reasonably take over once he's gone. And so we have to recognize that these processes are not going to change overnight. We have to be thinking strategically in terms of 10, 20, 30, 100 years, what this looks like for a democratic world. This is not something that we're going to fix overnight. Maybe we had that illusion after the fall of the Soviet Union. We had this idea that these things can happen overnight, and yes, they can, but we also have to recognize the structures and systems that are in place that kind of create some sort of path dependency for the future of these countries.
All right, well, we're going to go to question and answer in just a minute. Looks like the Q&A is getting spicy, so I'm going to jump in there in a second. Before we do that, just give us one happy thought, one country where, and that's the thing about your Freedom House reports. If you actually look at the partly free line, that one goes up too. And there's some countries in the completely free that haven't totally, decayed. So tell me one country where you're excited about the progress for democracy. Tell our audience that, and then I'm going to look in the Q&A and select some questions for.
I'm going to jump in first because I want to take Ukraine. Sorry, Laura. I don't know if you wanted to bring up Ukraine, but honestly, Ukraine is sort of this example for me. It was not a perfect country. It's ranked as partly free in Freedom of the World. It's ranked as sort of this transitionary hybrid regime. In my report, Nations in Transit, they have made incredible progress over the last 8 years. And let's remember, this war has not been going on since February. It's been going on since 2014. And even during this time, they have made outstanding progress, particularly when it comes to the capacity of the state to solve issues for their citizens. They have decentralized in a way that has enabled kind of localities to push back against this invasion. A big part of why they've been so successful is local self-governance. They know how to do things at the local level, and civil society. Civil society has built up so much capacity and has always been really strong in Ukraine. But recent survey data shows that, before 2014, about 50% supported democracy as this kind of highest primary form of governance. That is now up to 64%. Like, we are seeing a commitment to democracy in Ukraine that we just haven't seen in recent years. And so as much as they are fighting this horrible war, I have great hope about the future of a democratic Ukraine.
And just very quickly, what is your degree of confidence that the incredible support for democracy is because of actual support for democracy and not for desire for weapons from the West?
No, I think it is, because when you look at what you kind of dig into the survey data a little bit more, it's not just support for like democracy as an ideal, it's support for democracy even in the face of difficult economic and social conditions. They think that democracy is more important than their own personal economic position in the country. And that to me speaks to sort of this real strong commitment to it.
Great. Laura?
Well, I would definitely second Ukraine. And I think that they are fighting, as Zelensky once said, we're fighting for all of your democracies. They represent not just only a struggle for their own democracy and existence, but sort of on behalf of us all. Instead of picking a country, I'm dodging your question. And what gives me hope is more the unbelievable spirit of democracy that we see existing in tough places. And so my mind immediately goes to Iran. So rather than award Iran this Improving Democracy Award, I will not. But it just, again, shows that the desire that exists everywhere, and the bravery and the courage from Belarus to Hong Kong to Iran of people standing up and saying, no, we want freedom, and that's the human experience. That is what we want. So those people give me the most hope.
It's a great answer. That's not a dodge. That's an artful answer. So kudos. All right. So lots of questions. Some come in from chat, some in the Q&A. Since we're talking about Ukraine, I'm going to go first to David Nordlanders. Given the backsliding of democracy and rise of authoritarianism in Europe, why is the quote unquote battle of freedom happening in Ukraine, as the neocons view it? Ukraine has even less democratic traditions and more corruption than Poland and Hungary. The Atlantic, come on, let me out of this, has published numerous articles from neocon perspective without acknowledging this major irony. I don't control the editorial side, so I'm passing on that sentence. Essentially, is NATO risking nuclear war over Ukraine for a fight it is losing elsewhere in Europe?
I'm so skeptical to even bring up NATO in this question. I just don't think it's really the right framing of this question. I think Ukraine is sort of the center of this battle for democracy because Russia is trying to deny it its basic nationhood and right to self-determination. And so if Ukraine desires to be a part of NATO, that should be the decision of Ukrainians. Yes, there has to be an understanding that there will be repercussions for global security, for regional security. I think, that needs to be a discussion that happens within NATO. But nonetheless, it still comes back to the very basis of this, which is the right to self-determination of Ukraine, to choose the path that it wants to choose. And 8 years ago, when the Russian government invaded Crimea and Eastern Donbass, that was a decision to try to have veto power over Ukrainian citizens' desire to move westward, to have closer alignment with Europe and the West. And so, I think this whole discussion about NATO really kind of misses the point, which is the right of the fight for democracy is a right for self-determination, the right to kind of decide the future of one's own country.
Okay. Let's go to some of the other questions. So actually, the first question asked is from Harold Palmgarten, and he says, essentially, you guys are wrong about Poland, or at least Poland's case is contradictory, since much of the judicial removal were communist time appointments. Can I respond to that?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about Poland as a particular example. There were issues of lustration following the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were people in power during the communist era who were able to keep their jobs as a result of deals made to kind of keep the country going. I mean, democratization is not this neat process where you just immediately become a democracy from an authoritarian regime. But the problems that we're seeing now, Poland was an extremely strong democracy, like this shining example of democracy post the fall of the Soviet Union and communism. But what we're seeing now is a country and a leadership that is kind of manipulating the democratic institutions in a way to make things better for themselves. And so you take the example of the judiciary. What's happening is they had an independent judiciary, and unlike in Hungary, where they have a constitutional majority and can kind of just change the constitution, they've gone about this through legislation. they've changed it so that it's kind of defanged the ability of the judiciary to push back on a powerful executive, and have put in place a tribunal council, which has all of these sort of pro peace, on justice judges who can kind of let them do whatever they want, can push back on fundamental laws of the EU. And so, yes, there's like this hangover of the past years, but a lot of this is an abuse of the democratic institutions that have existed post-communism.
Good answer. All right, another good question. Well, actually, let's do this. It's kind of related to that. It's from Michael Kaplan. How is democracy doing in America?
Not great. So, like I said, I think this era that we're in is a wake-up call, that we've sort of, the older or wealthier democracies have been riding by on their laurels, thinking that they're, immune to rising autocratic threat. And in fact, perhaps that long history of democracy has made us a little lazy and not attentive to warning signs that have come along, like a boiling frog. So I think United States democracy is really in a, unfortunately, I wish I could be positive, I think it's in a dangerous point. And the reason it is because of people focus a lot on polarization, and that's absolutely true. But I think a more important component is just the absolute breakdown in trust. And without trust, democracy can't function. So if we're in a place where, a significant percentage of the population does not believe in the legitimacy of the current government and does not believe in elections as free and fair, then what are we to do about that? So I think what I'm worried about going forward, and what we're seeing in our work at ASD, is really focused on the elections, because they're sort of the gateway to democracy. And the fact that we are seeing, particularly at the states level, systems being put into place that could potentially thwart the outcome of the election, whether it's changing the way that the electoral college is appointed, stacking election polling stations with party insiders, changing the rules and legislation on party poll watchers, changing the way the state allocates electors, changing the rules about access to the ballot. All of these things could be very consequential going forward. But also, I think we've gotten into this place where, and it could transfer parties, by the way, but we're in a place right now where there have been polls that show that Republicans are saying, I just read one from Arizona, that if my candidate doesn't win, the election was stolen. I lose, therefore it was stolen. And that could easily jump parties, and maybe with more rationale, in fact, where these state laws have changed. The other party might say, hey, if I lost, but that's because they changed all these laws and they did this and it was an insider job, et cetera. And so I think that that's the dangerous place we're at. I also think the rise of violent extremism in the United States scares me, that we have such an availability of weaponry and guns. And then you have a law that allows poll watchers to come into a polling station and verify voter ID. It's just a combustious situation. So I don't think, I'm not one of those people that's screaming about civil war, but I do think we are at a precipice. I do think that violence and political conflict is in our future, at least in certain places. And so I wish that we were talking, I wish there was more of a wake-up call about this. I think that the way that many Americans have just sort of, let's move on from January 6th, that was nothing, instead of taking it as the warning sign that it was. So I'm not particularly positive right now.
Well, that leads to an interesting question from Neil Caldwell about some of the trade-offs here. How can democracies safeguard themselves and their institutions against illiberal authoritarian trends without compromising the civil liberties that are fundamental to their own existence?
Such a great question.
Yeah,
I mean, it's this constant, it's this constant tension between national security, one could say, and democracy. We saw it during the pandemic. of having people's political rights and civil liberties curtailed as a result of national health concerns. I mean, there's always going to be this tension. And yet, what's the solution to dealing with tensions in a democratic society? It's democracy. It's getting together and figuring out a way together that we can solve these issues. And that means having referendums. That means having elections. That means participating in civil society, not expecting the government to do things, but creating an NGO or a civic organization and doing the work that you need to do to kind of protect one's society. And so, you know, I always like get really angry when I hear people kind of make this distinction, because I don't think that they are mutually exclusive. I think that there are ways to make us safe. And so like the media is a great example, right? Let's not just ban RT or other like clear Russian propaganda channels. Let's just do a better job communicating ourselves. Let's fund independent media, do better civic education, provide people with a healthy media diet, teach them how to do these things in high school so that they know how to read the media in a healthy way. There's all these solutions that we have within democracy to address these issues. We just need to do the work to take them. You know, we need to do the work.
Are you a democracy absolutist? Like, has there ever been a time, professionally or analytically, where another value has come up against democracy and you've thought the other value trumps?
I'm not an absolutist on anything. I love that question, though. I mean, for me, our fundamental rights can be in tension with each other. I mean, this is just something that we see and that we as a society need to figure out. So, for instance, like the abortion question to me is one of these things where half the country thinks, or part of the country thinks that there's a right to life, and part of the country thinks that a woman's right to choose is more important. I think we should handle this in a democratic way. These kind of competing views of how society should organize itself and what laws we should have. We shouldn't have these dictated by, you know, unaccountable judges at the top who are in positions for life. This should be a decision that we as a country come to. And so you see in instances like in Kentucky, when given to the people, they make a particular decision that's counter to what, you know, people in power might do. And so I think ultimately when we have these kind of competing rights that come up against each other, we have to, as a society, as a country, as a democracy, figure them out together.
Wait, that's so interesting. Okay, so when the Dobbs decision came down, you were like, great, now the states can vote on abortion.
No, I think that's not the perspective that I would take. I would say, you know, this is something that we as a country need to decide. This is something that should be decided by us as a, you know, as a nation, not us as individual states. And again, this comes to the tension of federalism, right? Of like, we have to figure out what is the role of.
Wait, let's keep going on this like really complicated hypothetical.
Yeah, let's totally just keep going.
All right, so the Senate and the Congress say, fine, abortion's banned. No abortions after 6 weeks. You're good with that because that's a decision we made, right?
I personally would not be okay with that. And I think I would probably critique the.
You'd critique it and you'd say it's the wrong decision, but thank God democracy worked, right? At least it's not judges making this decision. At least it's not on the state level. Like the country came together, and elected legislators, they came together, Congress, Senate, passed this rule, no abortion after 6 weeks.
I mean, it's a good question. It is democracy to an extent, but we have to recognize at the same time there are deficiencies to that democracy, right? We have an anti-majoritarian system in the Senate that doesn't actually represent, you know, the will of the people in some cases, and so, you know, there are complications. It's messy, right? There has to be a way to figure this out within a democracy, because as you say, what's the other option? It's the opposite of democracy. It's whatever is not democracy.
Laura, you want to answer the abortion hypothetical?
Well, oh boy. Well, yeah, first of all, as Mike said, our Congress making a decision is not a majority decision. I mean, the Senate is you know, what a person in Wyoming has 1,000 times the vote power of someone from California. So I wouldn't say that is a good example of democracy. I think also what you're talking about here is a tension between majoritarianism, which is what liberalism tries to correct. So I believe my autonomy over my body is a fundamental right. And I don't care if the majority doesn't agree in that fundamental right. And that's why you have liberalism, because you will have countries where, for example, I used to live in the country Georgia, and the majority was definitely not supportive of the LGBTQ community. Okay, well, what about the rights of the individual? What about the rights of the minority? Shouldn't there be protections for them? What if the majority of the population decides that, hey, this religious minority should be wearing a specific kind of attire so that we can identify them? That's a majority opinion. Doesn't it also, is that enough? No. That's why you have protections for minority. So I think the tension, and this has always existed, and there aren't any easy answers to this, is that we don't have populism. That's not the goal, is not just ruckshod majority rule. We have liberal democracy, and the liberal in there is to protect fundamental rights of individuals and communities and different groups.
And okay, so this is super complicated. Unfortunately, we only have 3 minutes left, but very quickly, how do you square? I mean, what I'm hearing is I'm all in favor of democracy, except democracy sometimes crosses lines that I'm not willing to let it cross, and then I oppose whatever the form of democracy is, or I will criticize the way that democracy is formed. Where can a country and a society draw those lines? How do you sort through that? I can see how you sort through it on an individual level, but how does a society sort through it? Give us a very quick understanding of how to answer that, and then we will close this up.
These are the questions of our time. So we have to find that balance between developing institutions and systems that deliver on behalf of the people and a representative democracy, and then also have protections in place. And it might not always be the perfect mix. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, you are going to have decisions and institutions that do not always serve the purpose that you would like. And you are going to have majorities that might not, view the world in the same way as sort of a global international standard. But that's the only thing we can achieve. And so trying to sculpt these systems, which is what I was doing for decades when I was working on democracy overseas, this is always a little bit of give and take, that you need to make sure you're having the right checks and balances in place. Yes, you have a legislature that is elected by the people, but you have other bodies that you put in place to provide a little bit of balance there, whether it's the courts, an ombudsperson's office, you have a separate executive, whether you have these sort of balances in place that allow some pushback and friction in your system. And I think we're always still struggling to get that right balance. And they oftentimes go out of whack. And I don't think there's a perfect example of the perfect country that's managed this, but maybe Mike has better ideas than I do.
The other question I want to ask is, how is it that you lived in Indonesia in 1990, 20 years in Cambodia, you lived in Georgia and 20 years overseas, and you still look younger than me? Whatever you're having for lunch, I would like also.
I think it's the Zoom filter.
Mike?
No, I think, to me, you cannot design yourself out of these problems. We cannot picture a perfect democratic system. That's the thing. Like even in freedom in the world, we have countries that like rank at the top of our rankings. They are not perfect democracies. They have these problems within their societies themselves. Even if their institutions work really well, nevertheless, conflict will always happen between individuals because we are selfish individuals. We have our own views. And so all we can do is strive to have the best institutions we can that provide for our political rights and our civil liberties. And so this tension's always going to exist, but we have to trust in the process that democracy and liberal democracy are the best ways to address these.
All right. Well, this panel's not a democracy. I'm an authoritarian, and I got to end it because it's 11 o'clock because I answer to the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and that's what they told me. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Laura. That was a fabulous conversation. Thank you to everybody who asked all those great questions. Thank you to our robust, wonderful audience. Thanks so much for listening. That was a lot of fun. See y'all later.